Good evening on this snowy Ash Wednesday. Welcome to the 2017 Symposium on St. Thomas Aquinas, sponsored by the Joyce McMahon Hank Aquinas Chair in Catholic Theology and made possible through the generosity of Joyce McMahon Hank, St. Mary's class in 1952. We may be asking too much of classical Christian theology, as represented by St. Thomas Aquinas, to reflect concern about the environment. Yet on the other hand, as Thomas would say, we may be letting it and him off too easily. In an oft-cited essay from 1967 entitled The Historical Roots of Our Environmental Crisis, Lynn White did not hesitate to assign blame to Aquinas' time, place, and biblical sources. Quote, "The present increasing destruction of the global environment," he said, "is the product of a dynamic technology and science which were originating in the Western medieval world. Christianity inherited from Judaism," White argued, "a striking story of creation. By gradual stages, a loving and all-powerful God had created light and darkness, the heavenly bodies, the earth and all its planets, animals, birds, and fishes. Man named all the animals, thus establishing his dominance over them. God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes. Christianity," White continued, "in absolute contrast to ancient paganism and Asia's religions, not only established a dualism of man and nature, but also insisted that it is God's will that man exploit nature for his proper ends. Hence, we shall continue to have a worsening ecologic crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence save to serve man." Close quote. One response of those currently writing about the environment from within the Jewish or Christian traditions that honor that Genesis story of creation is to do what our speaker tonight has previously referred to as skimming for the green parts, as they craft their own path forward while strategically and selectively ignoring the biblical primacy of the human in their theological forebears. But Dr. Willis Jenkins, Associate Professor for Religion, Ethics, and the Environment at the University of Virginia, has set himself a more theologically substantial task of diving deeply into the well of Thomist theology and anthropology, the heart of the medieval beast, to reappropriate the fundamental elements of Thomas's thought for an environmental age. As the Church itself makes its own transition towards stewardship concerns, represented most recently and thoughtfully by Pope Francis's Laudato Si, bridge building between Francis's encyclical and the thought of Thomas Aquinas, universal doctor of the Church, holds special promise for those concerned about both. Dr. Jenkins is the author of 2 award-winning books, The Future of Ethics, Sustainability, Social Justice, and Religious Creativity, from Georgetown, 2013, which won an American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence, and Ecologies of Grace, Environmental Ethics and Christian Theology, Oxford, 2008, which won a Templeton Award for Theological Promise. We are delighted to have him with us this evening to celebrate and extend the theological legacy of St. Thomas Aquinas. The title of the lecture is After Laudato Si, Revisiting the Ecological Legacy of Thomas Aquinas. Please help me welcome Dr.
I hope you're enjoying the screensaver that I picked for you there. Okay. So, I'm grateful to be here in the St. Joseph River watershed on Ash Wednesday at St. Mary's, the first college available to women in the Great Lakes region, about which I've learned a good deal at dinner. What an amazing community you have. I'm grateful to be here. So I want to thank Joe for the invitation to be at St. Mary's and to be part of the St. Thomas Aquinas Symposium. I've long been a reader of Thomas, but I'm not a specialist in Thomist scholarship, so I think it's generous to invite a relative outsider to this. I work primarily on religious dimensions of environmental ethics, where indeed I've written about the legacy of Thomas in contemporary environmental thought. And tonight I want to reconsider aspects of that legacy in light of Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical Laudato Si'. And I want to say I'll do so in a way that follows some critical questions introduced by Joe already. But I want to make clear from the outset that my point here is really not, especially as a non-Catholic, to attempt to criticize St. Thomas or the current Pope, but rather to sharpen the potential of something that they share, which is a moral anthropology that is quite different from the prevailing way of being human in our society. The picture of the human person developed in the Thomist tradition and carried through the modern encyclicals is so strange to the image of personhood carried by consumerist culture that anyone who recognizes something of her own humanity in the Thomist view must feel herself in some way at odds with our dominant culture. So I aim to develop that contrast. That's what I'm after. I have found myself over the previous months turning over in my thought a particular paragraph from Laudato Si'. We are living in a time in which it is said that the real people of this country fear refugees and don't care about climate change. That the people want to ban Muslims and build pipelines. And why I think I have found my thoughts turning over this particular paragraph is its lovely spirit and hope. And authentic humanity seems to dwell in the midst of our technological culture, almost unnoticed, like a mist seeping gently beneath a closed door. Will the promise last, in spite of everything, with all that is authentic rising up in stubborn resistance? And I think I'm drawn to that paragraph because it suggests that simply living out a human life authentically, which many people do in spite of everything, is itself a kind of resistance to the exploitation and exclusions that may increasingly be built into normal life. So, what does the encyclical mean by authentic humanity? And how do you live an authentic human life in a way that resists the forces driving climate change, which is a major preoccupation of the encyclical? So I'm going to move forward to answering just that question. What is authentic humanity? By starting from the opposite hypothesis already introduced by Joe. And that is that the contemporary views of humanity represented by the encyclical tradition, rooted as they are in medieval Christian theology, are actually culpable for environmental destruction. So I want to trace these ideas of dominion from Thomas through the modern encyclicals in order to then consider how Laudato Si' attempts to receive and transform that tradition, and then what becomes of Thomas as it does. Okay, so that's the path. So here, real quick, is the case against Thomas. You already heard it outlined. For many contemporary environmental thinkers, Thomas Aquinas represents exactly the traits responsible for an ecological crisis, which is anthropocentrism and dominion. Thomas's hierarchical cosmology seems to rank creatures by their relative dignity, making them all subservient to the needs of humanity, whose own dignity is fulfilled by transcending creation. And it's not hard to find passages from Thomas that seem to support that view. So here's one from the Summa. The imperfect are for the use of the perfect, as the plants make use of the earth for their nourishment, and animals make use of plants, and man makes use of both plants and animals. Therefore, it's in keeping with the order of nature that man should be master. This is proved by the order of divine providence, which always governs inferior things by the superior. Wherefore, as man, being made in the image of God, is above other animals, these are rightly subject to his government. Man's last end is uncreated. The uncreated good, God. So humanity's purpose looks like it does indeed lie beyond earth, beyond all creation, which suggests that humans belong to another realm, ordered to the goods of another order. Not the goods of the St. Joseph River watershed, but the goods of the heavenly kingdom of God. And, other creatures, they don't look like they really have a part in this. Man and the other rational creatures, the angels, attain to their last end by knowing and loving God. This is not possible to other creatures. They're not part of the kingdom. They remain behind in the watershed. So those ideas, they seem to support exactly Lynn White's view. Famously argued that the roots of contemporary ecological crisis lie in this medieval religious world. It's there that the technological culture that we now inherit began to develop by taking advantage of the Christian assumption that nature was made for humans and humans made for something else, an otherworldly destiny. Christianity in its Western form, said White, is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. And people in contemporary technological societies, they may not be Christian, they may not think of themselves as religious in any way, but they are living in a culture whose deep code organizes the relation of nature and humanity according to these medieval axioms, thus the need for new axioms. So, in other words, the cultural logic that leads to a planetary crisis of climate change can be found in the religious worldview of Thomas Aquinas. Important to point out, Lynn White, the historian, did not think that all of Christianity, or even all of Western Christianity, was a problem. He proposes St. Francis as a source for an alternative form of Christianity that would lead to a better ecological politics. Remember that, and we'll come back to that. So that's the critique, and many people, including myself, have objected to White's thesis generally, and many people, including myself, have pointed out there are features of Thomas Aquinas' theology that don't conform to dominating anthropocentrism. I mean, he's not anthropocentric, obviously, he's theocentric. And creatures can't be used any what way. There's certain uses that are incompatible. And anyway, whatever kind of uses there are, they have to take place in this, broader ecology of the virtues, right? But to take my own advice and not skim for the green parts, I don't want to skim over the bit. Those passages are dominionist, right? And that dominion is precisely the bit that is most often cited in the modern encyclical tradition. So I want to show you now. Okay, why? So I'm going to move very quickly over a century of encyclicals here, just to draw out a couple points where this happens, where dominion establishes human dignity. The idea that the natural order makes a special place for a creature with a supernatural end whose dignity is exercised on earth by exercising dominion has been central to the way that the modern social encyclicals establish and defend the universality of human dignity. So, to start it off, Rerum Novarum in 1891, the encyclical that inaugurates Catholic social teaching in the eyes of many, by theologically addressing, in its time, the conflict between capitalism and socialism, says, "It is in the soul that sovereignty resides, in virtue of which man is commanded to rule the creatures below him and to use all the earth and ocean for his advantage. In this respect, all men are equal. There is no difference between rich and poor. They all share in dominion." Everyone gets to participate in that status. It's leveling. It's universalizing. Pacem in Terris in 1963, which is often remembered for providing the most robust early ground for human rights in the Catholic social tradition, does so by appealing to human exceptionalism. God created man in his own image and likeness, endowed him with intelligence and freedom, made him Lord of creation. And as such, he has rights and duties which together flow as a direct consequence from his nature, his anthropology. These rights and duties are universal. And then the important encyclical on global economic development, Popularum Progressio in 1967. The Bible, from the first page on, teaches us that the whole of creation is for man, that it is his responsibility to develop it by intelligent effort and by means of his labor to perfect it for his use. And then, just to bring us to where we are, these two from John Paul II writes, man has to subdue the earth and dominate it, because as the image of God, he is a person, understood as a process whereby man and the human race subdue the earth. Work corresponds to this basic biblical concept. Only when throughout the process man manifests himself and confirms himself as the one who dominates. And then, in the encyclical that celebrates 100 years since Rerum Novarum, and which includes not insubstantial attention to environmental problems, John Paul II reiterates this point. God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of all its members without excluding or favoring anyone. Okay, so the point of all these dominion passages, the reason I'm rehearsing them here, is because the encyclicals are using dominion to establish the universality of human dignity, and that helps explain why members of this tradition do not get along well with politics that seem to privilege the humanity of some over others, why members of this tradition will resist actions that appear to degrade the humanity of some relative to others, why members of this tradition are likely to affirm the universal dignity of immigrants and indigenous, refugees and citizens, criminals or innocent, enemies, even terrorists. In Catholic social tradition, they all have human dignity, right? That's central to what it is to be a real person. Being a real person, authentic humanity, starts from sharing in dominion, from this status, and recognizing that this status is shared with every other human. So, that's very powerful. However, this human universality is established by radically privileging one species over all the others. It's established by human exceptionalism. And by the light of some environmental criticism, it appears that a consequence of this way of establishing human dignity is a view of human persons as utterly separate from their world, of humans possessed of a soul that's severed from the flesh of creation. And that's actually worse than anthropocentrism. I mean, it's worse than merely promoting the species-level egoism of one over others. It's cultivating a moral anthropology in which humans experience themselves as radically different from other creatures, possessed of an interiority severed from relations with the rest of Earth. In other words, it seems that it doesn't matter much for your humanity that you live in the St. Joseph's River watershed, or that the ways of life that we all participate in are sickening this watershed and the planet. So again, just to be clear, there are ways of defending this tradition. I'm just explaining how the criticism goes because it raises a question about that central legacy of Thomas and then about the assumptions of much of modern industrial culture that Laudato Si is receiving and attempting to write into. So, what's Laudato Si going to do with this tradition? He's writing into a world that seems sickened by bad forms of domination. What's he going to do with dominion? Well, Laudato Si works with it in two ways. It extends the consequences of universal dignity to include environmental injustice. And at the same time, it also requalifies what dominion means by making it first refer to contemplation rather than to control. And both moves are connected to a critique of what the encyclical calls the technocratic paradigm of modern industrial culture. That term had appeared in earlier encyclicals already. Laudato Si connects it to the instrumentalism of a problem-solving rationality. Rather than a problem to be solved, the world is a joyful mystery to be contemplated with gladness and praise. If you've not read the encyclical already, you probably know from media coverage about it that it's all about how humanity must solve some very urgent environmental problems. But I think a good subtitle for the encyclical might be, "Don't solve climate change." Because environmental problems, the Pope is worried, will become occasions for intensifying the domination of Earth and of people by the powerful. They will become occasions for a problem-solving mentality to exert even more control. So, it is true, obviously, in the United States that our first impulse has been to deny that there are problems, and we're not really through that phase altogether yet. But when they do recognize a problem, Pope Francis thinks, wealthy actors will move very quickly towards solutions that protect and reinforce their power over planet and people. The way that we manage environments already naturalizes inequality. Not long after the contracts are signed and the aqueducts are built, it comes to seem that fresh water has always flowed from poorer areas to affluent cities. or that toxins just happen to concentrate in poor neighborhoods as if that was their natural habitat. In the case of climate change, it comes to seem natural that rising seas engulf coastal settlements in the south, but do not overcome the defenses of North Atlantic cities. So up there on the left, you will see the very cool tidal defense system of the Netherlands to protect against excessive surges of seawater. And on the right, missing from a similar kind of channel in Bangladesh, what happens without that defense, right? So what the encyclical is pointing out is if the response to climate change is like the technocratic paradigm on the left, build this elegant, lovely defense against the rising seas, that simply increases the distance between the vulnerable and the affluent. And so the encyclical is here taking that principle of universal human dignity and working out its implications in a world of environmental hazards. If everyone has an equal share in dominion, if Earth really is for everyone, like Pope John Paul II had said, then it's a violation of human dignity if the lifestyle of the affluent exposes the vulnerable to grave harm. And it is spectacularly unjust that the affluent world would invest in protecting themselves from problems that they are causing while leaving the vulnerable unprotected, thus reinforcing and extending the advantage of the powerful over the poor. Laudato Si keeps that dynamic constantly in view. Environmental injustice is a central point to the encyclical, and I think that in itself secures its status as groundbreaking. It establishes that the church and humanity generally must hear the cry of the poor in climate change. Just as in 1891, Rerum Novarum was new for the way that it brought theological attention to the way that human dignity is vulnerable to economic structures, Laudato Si is bringing theological attention to the way that human dignity is vulnerable to environmental systems. But then, Francis goes on to begin to transform what dominion means. We must also hear the cry of the earth, he says. It opens, as you must know, invoking our sister Mother Earth, quoting a hymn from St. Francis. And Laudato Si writes that this sister now cries out to us because of our abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. Look at the change in theme. Not from use and perfect these goods that belong to humanity, but don't abuse these goods which are endowed to her, to Earth. Now, if it sounds weird to you to hear the cry of Sister Earth or Mother Earth, that sounds strange. That might be because of a massive cultural mistake that we have inherited, that for 200 years, for the time of the fossil fuel empire, we've imagined ourselves as separate from nature and masters of it as of an inert storehouse of resources. The encyclical is suggesting that the mindset, that problem-solving, see the world as resources mindset that legitimates ecological exploitation, also silences our ears to the voices of creation. And climate change is a symptom of what happens when we live by that illusion, by that inauthentic humanity. That 200-year-old mistake about the sort of creature that we actually and authentically are. If hearing the cry of Mother Earth requires a big shift for us in our sense of the kinds of things that we can know and experience in our world, then the encyclical suggests that's because of the modern problem-solving mindset that suppressed the possibility, the very idea that Earth can speak. In other words, we live by a mistaken idea of dominion. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. You may think, well, I was just reading about how we are supposed to see ourselves as lords and masters. Well, what about that? Francis makes it plain. Where anyone has used the biblical tradition to legitimate tyranny over creation, their understanding of Scripture was mistaken. That, I think, maybe the deepest theological shift in the encyclical, possibly its most enduring significance. For more than a century, I've just illustrated, the encyclicals have consistently connected human dignity with dominion over creation, drawing on a central thread in Latin Christianity, emphasized in Augustine and perfected in Thomas, that is all about lordship and mastery. But without departing from that tradition, Pope Francis requalifies it. He requalifies dominion by emphasizing contemplation over practical use. Exercising dominion means, first of all, becoming capable of hearing the many songs of other creatures and of joining their own ways of praising God. So basically, the mistake is pretty simple. It's not that dominion was wrong, it's that you had the idea of what it meant. Dominion is spiritual, it's not technocratic. We become fully human by learning Earth's varieties of goodness, not by deploying power to capture Earth's resources for our own projects. On this view, the people who first clear-cut this watershed's hardwood forests and drained its bogs, they probably got that wrong. They had the wrong idea of dominion in their mind. Authentic humanity emerges from learning to use the world rightly, which entails, first of all, refusing to regard it as an object to be used. St. Francis was subversive, writes the Pope, because his asceticism was a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. In contemplation, persons need the world, first of all, in order to discover the dignity of other creatures and so find their own dignity. Yeah, you need the world, and you need to use it, but you need to know how to use it so that you find its goodnesses and so find your own. So, if hearing the cry of Mother Earth sounds very weird to Christians, that's because the encyclical suggests those Christians are in need of ecological conversion. That's Francis's term, ecological conversion. Their hearts have been hardened into indifference by some kind of problem-solving consumerist culture, some technocratic mistake, and so they can't hear the voice of Mother Earth and the dying silence of a biological world that's going through a major extinction event is directly related, on this interpretation, to a silence in our hearts and in our minds. So, that's incredibly powerful in itself, and we'll be happy to talk more about that. But so what has happened to Thomas at this point? It seems that what's happened to the legacy of Thomas? I mean, on one view, it could look like Laudato Si simply mutes it. For an encyclical that is marked by exuberant quotation of theologians, there's just one paragraph on Thomas, which is quickly followed by another hymn of St. Francis. Perhaps, the Pope is sort of following Lynn White's counsel and move away from St. Thomas and more to St. Francis. Maybe. But I think that there's more that could have been said there, in line with the ecological argument of the encyclical, and I think also a good, plausible reading of Thomas. My reading of Thomas is a good reading of Thomas. I think Laudato Si might have more explicitly argued that God draws humans into friendship with God by teaching them how to give expression to the goodness and the beauty of earth and her creatures. And I think that's an interpretive possibility in Thomas, although it's not one often developed. And the reason it's probably not often developed is because scholars are hesitant to undermine the grounds of universal human dignity by taking the ground away from dominion, right? By taking away dominion, they take away the ground of human dignity. Thomas can help on just that point. I would argue that Thomas connects dominion to the goodness of creatures in a way that subverts its use for crude mastery in just the way that Laudato Si wants, while preserving also the distinctness of human dignity. In the Summa, where Thomas treats the very strong dominion language of Genesis 1, 26, 27, and also again, in his commentary in the Psalms, in Psalm 8:8, where the same Hebrew verb that is translated as subdue, rada, where that appears again in Psalm 8:8, Thomas does the same thing. He consistently refers the meaning of subduing to the story of God inviting Adam to name the animals. And in the same article from question 96 that I quoted above about the order of nature being, that man should be its master, Thomas points out that in Eden, humanity would have had no need for food or for clothes, so why are there animals? Man needed animals in order to have experiential knowledge of their natures. he needed to name them so that he could experience the various kinds of perfections that are manifest in a finite world from an infinite God. Before the fall, observes Thomas, the animals were not there for humans to eat or to otherwise use. They were there for humans to contemplate, to learn the varieties of goodness by which to praise God. By inviting humans to give creatures names expressive of their distinct good, says Thomas, God teaches humans how to name divinity from God's expressions in Earth's creatures. And knowing God is precisely how to become authentically human. Yeah. The purpose of humanity is union with the uncreated God, but we grow into that union in a way that is distinctive and accommodates our own created nature. Thomas says, we know and name God from creatures. Our knowledge of God is derived from the perfections which flow from God to creatures. Not that we can on our own way reason our way into union with God. There's some very nice line in Thomas to the effect of like, maybe, but there's undoubtedly going to be a lot of error, and it's super unlikely to happen. It's not a direct quote. Rather, what happens is that grace adopts this natural, reasoning, contemplative activity of the human creature, elevating it and perfecting it so that human minds may come to enjoy the mystery of the uncreated God whom they can only seek through creation. And so, what about those other creatures? Are they in fact cut off from salvation? This is the end of this quotation that I had up earlier, that it's not possible to other creatures. It goes on to say, which acquire their last end, insofar as they share in the divine likeness, inasmuch as they are, or live, or even know. Which is the particularist point. It's like not every creature shares in salvation in the same way. Knowing and loving God is something that only human creatures can do, which remains a source of their distinct human dignity. But other creatures, they don't have to do what humans do to participate in God. They do what they do. Other creatures have their own dignity. They share in the likeness of God by existing, by living, by knowing according to their own specific ways of interacting with earth. The coyotes native to this watershed have a coyote way of participating in the life of God, and it would be weird to ask them to participate in the human way of God in order to have a relationship to God. Only people after the Enlightenment would come up with such a silly idea. Dominion now means the exercise of understanding how creatures participate in the perfection of God. Subduing them means primarily, and first of all, at least in the state of innocence, pursuing the way that they exist in God intellectually. Learning the distinct goodnesses of each creature and their mutual relations, humans grow into God by a process that shapes them after the goods of other creatures. So we become, you could say it this way, we become deiform by becoming terraform. Union with God through communion with creation. The watershed, the fact that you live in this watershed is now spiritually important. So, the anti-Thomas bias of contemporary ecological thought, it's not required anyway. And in fact, I think it only makes sense if it is read under the assumptions of industrial age individualism and naturalism. Under the assumptions of an anthropology, as Jean Porter says, of Thomas read under the assumptions of Kant. Or what the philosopher Charles Taylor has described as the buffered self, the self that is impermeable to relations with nature and the divine. That was a unique achievement of modernity. The most serious environmental criticism of Thomas's dominion, what I'm saying is, only makes sense if it is read with assumptions about moral anthropology that Thomas himself could not possibly have shared. I'm not saying he's an environmentalist. He could not have shared that either. I'm just saying he could not have shared the moral anthropology that is at heart of the environmentalist critique of the medieval Catholic world. Okay. So if that's plausible, then that maybe explains what I think is a slight, not quite a weakness, but just two underdeveloped points in the encyclical Laudato Si. And I think that maybe they are underdeveloped because they don't have the best theological resources available in Thomas for making explicit several political implications of the argument in the encyclical. So for an encyclical that so strikingly and so surprisingly asks readers to hear the cry of the earth, and so strongly connects that cry to the cry of the poor, these two key shifts in the tradition, they are left with only indirect and implicit political support. First on the cry of the poor, you would have thought that there would be more about human rights to the environment. A human right to environmental quality seems like an obvious corollary of the encyclical's moral anthropology, but for some reason it's not exactly stated. It does say that there's a right to water. It suggests that humans have an equal right to atmospheric space, but those don't really connect to a more basic argument the encyclical could have made. It could have called for a coherent series of protections to prevent human dignity from ecological violence, which were already suggested by John Paul II. Rights like this: rights to participate in environmental decision-making, rights to information about environmental risks, rights to secure land tenure, rights to safe air, rights to be free from dangerous thresholds of chemical exposure. Insofar as human dignity is realized through ecological relations, it is vulnerable to those relations, and it's vulnerable to political violence mediated through ecological relations. You probably know that the most statistically significant predictor of where to find toxic risks in the United States is race. There are racist distributions of toxic risk. There are plutocratic distributions of vulnerability to flooding. So discussion about what precisely such rights would entail is an important arena of deliberation over the shape of human dignity, which is exactly the kind of dialogue that the encyclical is trying to elicit. A ground for making that kind of environmental right more explicit, I've argued, it's available in the kind of moral anthropology you'd find in Thomas. I think from Thomas you could even say if humans do need experiential knowledge of other creatures in order to know God, there might be a right to have access to meaningful biodiversity. That might be a matter of basic justice, not an elective affinity of the affluent. And secondly, on the cry of the earth, well, why not rights for nature? I was surprised. There's a strong movement. As I was reading the encyclical for the first time, I was like, I think I know where it's going. There's going to be rights for nature, because he opens with Mother Earth. There's a strong movement for rights for Mother Earth in South America, of which the Pope is certainly not ignorant. There are constitutional rights for Mother Earth in Ecuador and Bolivia. In direct political standing for nature seems a corollary of the encyclical's theological reasoning. If every creature has its own goodness, if they all possess a dignity or value which humans can learn to appreciate as we approach other creatures, if we might even be taught and transformed by them, they give voice to God's glory in their own ways, then you would seem that there's warrant for supposing that nature should have some kind of standing in political processes of environmental decision-making. As you know now, surely you know, that when we make environmental decisions, the courts need to see that there is standing of some significant human interest. You can't take into account the interest of the watershed itself or the coyotes or anything like that. We have to establish that, I have an interest because I really like coyotes, I like to watch them or whatever. So it's always by proxy. I have to say, I first made that observation, that hypothesis, that the encyclical seems to implicitly point towards rights for nature before a group of moral theologians, Catholic moral theologians, and I was roundly criticized for it. I think because they were concerned that it would erode the grounds for human dignity. Like, well, look, if coyotes can have rights, then what becomes of human rights? Like, it seems like we have a problem here. I think that was the concern. They were saying, surely he did not mean that. And the very next week, when Pope Francis addressed the General Assembly of the UN, shortly after the encyclical was released, Francis made a point of saying that a true right of the environment does exist. And there are two reasons why. He goes on to say, this is him, because any harm done to the environment is harm done to humanity, and because every creature, particularly every living creature, has an intrinsic value. This is so strange. It's not in the actual encyclical, but then he goes out of his way in a UN address to say a clear implication of what I'm saying is there ought to be rights for nature. Why? And I only think it is because, I don't know about cause. I have no idea about why. But I am suggesting this, that a robustly ecological reading of Thomas would offer theological ground for making that explicit, in a way that can allay the worries of moral theologians concerned for the erosion of ground of universal human dignity. Because with Thomas, there's the possibility of recognizing the ecological dimensions of human dignity, while at the same time rooting that dignity in a special theological vocation. That humans are special because this creature alone elevates the goods of creation by praising God with them. No other creatures do that, or are expected to do that. When Laudato Si claims that humans learn the real worth of creatures, not through instrumental mastery, but through contemplative membership, it describes the highest practice for realizing human dignity as a site where human minds become fully human by learning to hear the voices of other creatures. Again, mastery is spiritual. It's not the sort that exploits other creatures. So when the encyclical closes and says, by saying this, by calling on humans to take charge of this house, by then the readers know the paradox. Humans can only take charge if we don't approach the world as a thing to be controlled or a problem to be solved. We take charge by living authentically, which is to say, in ways that realize our own particular form of creaturely dignity. We are the creature whose natural function it is, includes seeing the goods of other creatures, to draw out those goods and give creative expression to them. So, in the Anthropocene, this time of pervasive anthropogenic influence through planetary systems, the encyclical has in its sights the anthropos, making humans better at being human. So what's the legacy for Thomas? What's the upshot here? Okay, on my reading, Thomas kind of both loses and wins. He loses because his muted reception in the encyclical implicitly confirms some of the criticism of the legacy, but he wins because the argument of the encyclical needs theological supplementation of the sort that I think something like Thomas's theology can best provide to that tradition. Or in other words, authentic humanity requires grounds of the sort that one can find in the reading of Thomas that I'm proposing. I'm closing now by reminding us on this first day of Lent the way that the encyclical closes, by upholding the nobility of little daily actions. And I love it. For an encyclical that has in view the planetary, the Anthropocene, throughout there's this focus on what I opened with, that what it means to lead an authentic human life in the everyday. And so he talks about public transportation and separating recycling. And Francis goes out of his way to admire any way he can think of where people prioritize beauty over efficiency or care for others over self-advancement. And those are hard but crucial spiritual disciplines in a world that imagines personhood differently, that imagines our pursuits differently. And that includes praying. Francis closes in prayer with this is one of his closing prayers. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey toward your infinite light. It's something like, teach us, all of us who are immigrants to the St. Joseph's River watershed, the worth of the coyotes and the beavers, Indiana bat and the eastern box turtle, the prairie fens and the hardwood swamps, because that's how we become real people. Authentic humans capable of hearing those particular songs of earth and the cries of the excluded. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Jenkins, for that very thoughtful talk. His work reminds me of something I tell my students, that it's theologically significant that Aquinas never finished the Summa, and that each in our own way and each in our own age, we are described for a spiritual completion. So thank you very much. We have time for some questions. I'd like to privilege students in the room. So please feel free to ask for any clarifications or any questions you have. There should be 2 microphones coming around, so if you have a question, just raise your hand and bring a microphone to you, and try to keep your question brief so that we get as many in as possible.
So my question, you kind of touched on it at the end, but I guess if you could give an example of how to live authentically or have this ecological conversion that both Francis talks about as a common person, just as a college person, like how we could, an example of living authentically, maybe like taking the bus or...
No, it's a great question. And my sense of the encyclical is that the Pope is so many small and different ways coming together in efforts to live authentically, right? So, like riding the bus is a real example for him. And also, of course, that is true of him personally, that he made a point of this all throughout his life. And the praying at meals and food practices and these everyday spiritualities certainly matter. So I would just say all those little things that are mentioned in the encyclical certainly count. And what I think what elevates their nobility is he's inviting us to see something that seems mundane, like just choosing to ride the bus or to take the extra moment to separate the recycling. That's his example. That this becomes part of a spiritual practice, and it becomes a way of attuning ourselves to the earth. And so it's not just about, well, if I take the bus, then I'm going to have a few pounds less of a carbon footprint, right? Or if I recycle, that this is going to have this a few ounces less of material throughput of there's this consequentialist calculus that's just like defeating in the end and dispiriting. He's not interested in. He's interested in how it's attuning us to the earth. And so I would say that, first of all. And then secondly, maybe this is more my own than what is actually in Laudato Si, but I was emphasizing the watershed all throughout. And I think this kind of watershed literacy of actually having a sense of how we fit in with other creatures and how our practices have become habitat for other creatures and how we rely on their habitat is to such a point that it would begin to make sense to talk of their voices, as we're invited to do, that I think that's where that spirituality goes eventually.
Yeah.
So I have a little bit of a question regarding your research in coming to some of your conclusions on Aquinas and the environment.
Yeah.
So as you wrestled with some of these encyclicals, sort of trying to understand the distinctiveness of all species, human and non-human, while acknowledging their interconnectedness and relation to each other, did you draw on any of Aquinas' work on the Trinity or the common good? And I haven't done extensive research in either of those topics, but I'm interested in them, and I wondered if they were able to support some of your conclusions.
Yeah, good. Great.
So the common good is that's easy. So that's yes. So once one begins to affirm that in Thomas's cosmology, every creature has its own integrity, its own good, and its own place in the common good of the universe, then the natural conclusion to draw from that is that an appropriate way to respect the goods of each individual creature would be in a way that supports their participation in a common good, or their ordering to a common good, a higher good. This is super good for ecological thought, right? Because if I get too excited about individual coyotes, I might begin to manage them in a way that's not good for the greater good of the watershed, right? So I can appeal to Thomas for the kind of holistic ecological thinking that runs against individualist animal welfare to pick up a common tension in environmental thought. So the Trinity question is very good. And so the way I would, So without getting too wonky about it, I think the way to read what it means for a creature to have a good is to say that God has communicated God's self in some particular way, has given God's self in a particular way in a creature. And one way of understanding what a creature is it is just a participation in a finite giving of God's self. And that what the Trinity is the perfection of that reciprocal exchange. I'm going to warrant that there is some kind of support for that in Thomas, but I can't point you to it just right now. But I think I just to say that's the kind of grammar, that's the kind of theological logic that connects the Trinity to this way of understanding the creaturely goods and their way of fitting into a common good.
So Thomas
way of knowing creatures seems like it's going to entail some metaphysical and teleological commitments to a kind of knowing that's going to look different, say, from Francis Bacon's way of knowing God through creatures. And it seems like outside of certain contexts, like a spiritual or religious context, I'm wondering what you think about how much purchase that sort of teleological reasoning is going to get. Does it seem important to me for what we all want to do, what Pope Francis wants to do? And how do you think about talking about that kind of way of knowing the world to people who maybe don't share the same things, and maybe integrating it with other forms of knowledge like contemporary science?
Yeah, that's a great question. Probably unanswerable. But so so this is how I think about that. What I've tried to sketch out is what I take to be a compelling grammar of moral relations that is clearly tied to a specific metaphysical structure. But I bet that, well, I know that in other forms of environmental thought, people are working towards that same grammar of moral relations, but with a different background metaphysical structure. And so so my way of working theologically in a pluralist scene is not to come in with the metaphysics and say, if you have this metaphysics, you're going to get to the right spot, right? You're going to get to watershed communion, right? I'm going to say, hey, you readers of Gary Snyder, you're really into watershed spirituality, aren't you? If you pull enough threads, that's going to raise some metaphysical questions. Here's the way that Thomas is going to warrant the kinds of relations that you're for. How are you going to do it? So basically, my answer is analogically. But that can be okay. So that can be frustrating because then that looks pretty soft. Actually, it looks like, well, then how was there any real resistance then to the metaphysical commitments that are actually at root of our contemporary industrial world? And I just want to point back to the encyclical as this, to my mind, striking tension between its incredible dialogical openness, right? I mean, Francis is calling for dialogue with other religions, with science, with indigenous cultures, between nations. He's calling for dialogue everywhere, right? And you have to wonder, well, if you have these calls for dialogue that are connected to a searing critique of what is in fact the dominant culture, the technocratic paradigm, what faith do you have that dialogue is going to come out right if you're not also requiring conversion to a particular belief system, which he's not. And he's not saying you have to become, Catholic to come to this view. He's saying let's enter into a dialogue about these basic questions that we all face on the planet now. And I guess I say all that because it seems to me the only way that you can have faith that dialogue comes out is if you think that your metaphysics is such that nature can in fact teach you in the end, and that is how the world is in fact structured, so that in the long run the dialogues will come out the right way. The pragmatism is pragmatism is the wrong word to use there. The dialogical openness will bend towards the actual grain of the universe.
Thanks, Professor Jenkins. To what extent do we find moral guidance by listening to nature versus bringing antecedent moral judgments to interpret nature? It seems to me that its witness is ambiguous. So the coyotes say, gang up on the weak and attack them, which we wouldn't take to be helpful. And then the raccoons say, protect us from the coyotes. So how do we adjudicate the very, ambiguous account that nature is giving to us? Are we just, do we know in advance what we have to do, or is nature really teaching us?
That's a good question, Professor Horner. So nature is always interpreted, absolutely. And I don't mean to suggest that with sufficient cold-eyed realism that we could get in front of our interpretations and just listen to nature as it is. And I think actually the invocation of Sister Mother Earth just foregrounds that. I mean, this is listening to the cry of earth comes to us in two kinship categories, sister, mother, that are in a song of St. Francis, but are especially resonant because indigenous peoples are pushing a Mother Earth cosmology, which they have a specific framework for interpreting. Like when they say Mother Earth has rights in the Constitution of Ecuador, it's also clear that you interpret what that means through indigenous ways of knowing, right? So there's like, here's the interpretive schema for it. And so that's just all to say, I'm not attempting to appeal to a kind of innocent naturalism. On the contrary, I think what is possible from Thomas is an interpretive schema that makes listening to nature an experiential possibility, and it comes with a metaphysics in which our listening can be corrected, but like it can bend. Like we can listen to the coyote and then think we've got it wrong because we not just because we wrote some poems about coyotes, but because we actually attended to how coyotes are and what they do and how they fit into a broader system. That should have some effect on our interpretation, but it is not self-interpreting. Which is just to say, also, yeah, look, you're right. So Thomas, he doesn't have to worry about all of these evolutionary problems. He's writing in a pre-evolutionary world, and his way of getting around natural evils is pretty quick because it doesn't look like natural evils are a structuring force of his cosmos. They're just there. So I'm simply saying evolutionary cosmology doesn't determine ecological ethics, but our interpretation of it certainly will affect how we listen to our watersheds. You can feel free to push back on that.
Thanks for broadening my vision, anyway, of the implications of Lao Tzu and Thomas Aquinas. I'd like to ask this question. Could we compare the problem that you're giving us to our current study of the U.S. Constitution? In some people's minds, it's an inert document that has no growth to it. It seems to me that Aquinas, his thought can be extended, not by guessing. You know, that when Thomas decided that he wasn't going to write anymore, people took up his work and they tried to extend it. I'd like to suggest that within Thomas Aquinas we have already implications for, especially in this realm, that Thomas has a interrelational view of creation, and that the implications for that, if drawn out, they don't have to be guessed at, I think, if they're drawn out, will show us that we have a yearning for unity with the environment, creation, if our culture hadn't impeded that. And that nature, creation, has a yearning for a relationship, or the relationship that's already there. We don't make a relationship, we do with our consciousness, but there already is a relationship. And I would suggest that if we took a look at Henri de Lubac's theology of nature and grace, we'd find out there are implications for the environment. In de Lubac tells us that nature cries out for grace. It yearns for grace. It seems to me that the creation, that each of us, we are yearning for a union, that's what's going on at the moment, with creation and nature, and then nature itself has a yearning by the way it's built into our whole environment. It seems to me there's some room here for, on the lost, the winning and losing of Aquinas, a little bit more on the winning side.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. Not least because de Lubac, a major emphasis, a major influence on how I came to read Thomas. Yeah. And I think the language you're using is very close to how I came to understand union, desire, mutual constitution. Absolutely. And so that is to say, I would be very happy to agree with the conclusion that in the long run, Thomas is winning here. Yeah, absolutely. On the right reading, certainly so. Yeah. I mean, I think if I just say one more thing, what the Lubach was attempting to correct is some of the assumptions or the ways of receiving modern metaphysics that he's attempting to correct are precisely some of the assumptions that continue to drive the critiques of Thomas in this arena. Right.
Thank you very much. Such a wonderful talk. I have a question that's going to go in a somewhat different direction, moving back maybe towards Laudato Si and environmental and social justice. Something that seemed to be implicit in some of the things that you were referring to, but I want to bring it to the surface and see what you think about it. That Laudato Si is addressed to everyone, and it's the opening of dialogue. And yet you mentioned it doesn't include it doesn't go as far in terms of addressing environmental injustice and talking about rights to, say, self-determination in relation to environmental decision-making as it could. And there's a strain in Laudato Si when it talks about hearing the cry of the poor, where it's implicitly addressed not to the poor, and that the poor are left crying out, but are not given a participatory role other than, like the earth, crying out in anguish. And so I guess I'm wondering if there is more implication in Laudato Si about how the poor can speak and gain agency in this dialogue aside from crying out.
That's a great question. It's a great observation. Yeah. I mean, I just want to say I think that's an important question for a reading of the text. It's a great observation. And I think it also holds true for the cry of the earth, in that it's not clear whether and how earth has a voice in these dialogues. And among a number of the contexts that the encyclical points out as context for environmental education, is striking some of the things that are left out, actually. So it doesn't talk about watersheds. It doesn't talk about indigenous ways of knowing. And it doesn't, it goes out of its way to quote from so many of the regional pastoral letters. And I was stunned to see that it didn't quote from the Columbia River watershed bishop's letter, which is the only bishop's letter ever written not from a political or ecclesiastical jurisdiction, but from an ecological jurisdiction, and attempts to listen to it. And so anyway, I just want to say, yes, that is a good question, and I think it has a rough parallel with the other cry. Yeah. I mean, do you have more to say about that?
No, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I haven't had the opportunity, since I've been thinking about it deeply, to go back and reread Laudato Si, in particularly that length. But I thought we might have, and we've gotten farther than I have, and also maybe Thomas has something to say about that, but I don't more than dip my tiny tip of my toe into Thomas, so I don't know what the resources there might be.
Yeah. No, I think the resources are substantial in Thomas. I mean, if you have a moral anthropology in which in which human dignity is somehow vulnerable to any relation, including ecological relations, then those ecological relations are deserving of the same kinds of protections that are as are other forms of political vulnerability. I mean, I think that one is pretty easy to establish from the Thomist legacy as it's developed through the encyclicals, and I think you're just simply right to observe that it could stand to be more robustly articulated. And certainly there are obviously ongoing evaluations of the relationship between liberation theology and magisterial theology that other people here can say more about, probably.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. My question has to do with a sort of, and maybe it's my anthropocentric need to solve problems, but my question is I've sort of lamented the lack of talk about solidarity in Pope Francis's Laudato Si. I sort of think of solidarity as a sort of a global theological flow that comes from the Catholic social tradition and from liberation theology, and it's an individual and a social virtue, I think, and it's missing from what I think it was a very complex problem, and that the concept of solidarity could maybe strengthen some of his arguments. He uses conversion, but not solidarity. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, why do you think it's missing?
Why do I think it's missing?
Yeah.
Well, I like your points about, he's trying to get us to sort of sit with the earth, I guess, sit with the problems instead of controlling them. Your comments on that, but I don't know.
Yeah.
He says something about it's overused. In Laudato Si, there's a paragraph something about it being overused. So.
Yeah, I don't know, and I'm not such a close observer of the writing of encyclicals that I fully understand some of decisions like that, like why in his perception solidarity is overused. I don't know. What I was impressed when I was with this group of Catholic moral theologians who were digesting the encyclical shortly after it came out, and what I was mainly impressed at is that they saw layers upon layers of rhetorical and theological decision that did not occur to me because they're such close watchers of how the writing process goes. So find an expert on that one. Yeah. But I just want to say, I don't mean to dismiss it cursorily. That's another good observation. Here's a concept and a theme that would seem to be apt for the set of issues that the encyclical is addressing. Why is it not there? And then that should raise, you must assume that it's not accidental, and that so that there are decisions of either theological or social interpretation behind that. Yeah.
So Thomas discusses that creatures are made unequally and have different levels of good. So I'm just wondering how you would say this affects their telos and how it affects our human responsibility towards creatures, and how we should prioritize ecological issues based on that.
Yeah. Okay. Good question. The language of inequality and imperfection, I'm suggesting, is apt for misunderstanding by modern readers, who may see that as evidence of lack of worth, and I don't think that's. And so I just want to say the first thing I would say is, in the reading I'm offering, that's not what's happening in Thomas. That inequality an imperfection refers to the finitude of divine goodness that each creature instantiates, but the fact that they, as Thomas said, exist or live, or maybe even know, suggests that they do participate in particular finite ways in the good. But then the second part of your question is very important. So then what does that mean for our ecological thinking if we have a theological reading of the variability of participation in divine goodness? Well, how does that inform environmental decision making? And I'm not sure it's one-to-one, but I would say that, just to repeat something I said a little bit earlier, that this maps on really nicely to some forms of modern ecological science and ecological management, which wants to think about how particular creatures have functions that play a role in communities and in ecosystems and in broader planetary systems. And then if we could think about, if we could find a way to mesh the theological vision of creatures participating in divine goodness in various ways, in various, let us say, fullnesses, and also, and as they do, they are participating in the common good of Earth, and then of the universe, and then of God's own life. That in a similar way, there's at least a kind of analogical relation to the way that ecologists think about the way that creatures exhibit a kind of value, or realize a kind of value. And how that value has its meaning because it is held in the system that makes it possible, and how the value of that system is a higher one because it makes the the value, the possibility of each creature, a conditional possibility, and how all that rests in broader evolutionary systems and a broader cosmos even, right? So that's a long-winded way of saying I think Thomas maps on pretty well to the kind of holistic environmental thinking that I think that there are other grounds to want in a contemporary world. And they can help make sense of things like, well, how do you actually manage the St. Joseph's River watershed, right? What do you do when there are invasive creatures and there are different kinds of relations between creatures? And some of those creatures are, a few cells, and others are complex mammals. Like, what do you do with that? Like, are they all equal? Oh, I think we need to have a vocabulary for talking about inequality that doesn't begin to slide into the sense that there's a lack of fundamental worth that every creature participates in. Just like Thomas, when someone goes on at length, he's struggling with the question. In Thomas, when the answer is like this long, it's like he's really working on that one.
I think there were many things that were really good about the talk, so thank you. That's a setup punch, right? So one of the things that I think is brilliant about the talk is the way that you have attended to the role that contemplation is playing both for Francis and Thomas's thought. And I think the way in which you have recognized that for Thomas, human contemplation is fundamentally an embodied activity, both in terms of the things that we know, so the need for other creatures, for us to come to know God, because we're not angels. Yeah. But also in terms of the way that we as embodied knowers actually carry out that. So I think these are really valuable contributions. One question that I have for you, and it sincerely is a question, is whether you think that it would be possible to hold on to the sort of value of contemplation that people like Francis and Thomas have with a worldview that was reductively materialist. If I can phrase the question just in slightly different terms, to use a structure that you use, a heuristic device that you use, it's one thing to talk about the sort of moral grammar that we're setting up. It's another thing to talk about the sort of metaphysical underpinnings of that grammar. Yeah. And I agree with you that we can often have agreements about moral grammar, but have very different ideas about the metaphysics, or whether there even is a metaphysics underpinning. So I'm curious whether you think that it's possible to have this particular kind of moral grammar with the metaphysics that is reductively materialist, or whether you need something more, something like spirit, say, or form, or whatnot.
That's a great question. And I have to answer it experientially. So at the University of Virginia, and before that at Yale University, I work with environmental scientists. Most environmental scientists in their research work are committed to a reductively materialist view. That's the background assumption of their research. Not of their whole lives, but of their research, right? And at the same time, everyone I work with is disturbed about what's going on in human interactions with the world. And they are almost always interested in any lexicon that gives them some way of articulating why they suffer the disturbance of the world, and in their sense, the degradation and destruction of it. And on the other hand, the good, the value, the worth that might be lost. So there's a guy at the Yale School of Forestry and Environment named Oz Schmitz who's totally just hard-nosed evolutionary ecologist. He works on evolutionary relationships between spiders and grasshoppers. And it's so tedious. He's got these little tiny squares he puts out in fields, and he counts these like ecological relations, these different trophic relationships. And it's just like equations and numbers, and it's just the reductionist that you get, right? But one time, we were together on a panel, and someone from the audience asked him if he thought that the spiders and the grasshoppers could think. And I was like, oh, he's gonna crush them. And he got so emotional and started talking about how the worlds that he thinks they experience and their stress and the different ways that they know. And he felt relieved that he was in a space in which that was a possibility. And he certainly was not granting with his relief at the possibility of talking about these things and the entire metaphysical entailment that might go with it. He simply, I think, was saying, it is somehow appropriate to use intelligence, experience, and stress, even if I don't think it would ever be appropriate to put in a paper that gets published in Science. Which is a long way of saying that I think that there are, vocabularies that are cultivated in a number of religious traditions. What makes this one so helpful is that there's a line of self-conscious reflection on the logic by which it changes, which is brilliant. But in many religious traditions, I mean, this is kind of the line I take as a religionist in a pluralist university I work with lots of different departments, is that there are these vocabularies that are cultivated in many traditions that they give interpretive perspectives on the universe in which we live. And if you can just bracket for a moment what metaphysics might seem to be required in the background of that, and focus on what are the relationships that play here. And so a great example, again, is indigenous communities. Like, you don't have to go all in for animism to think that there is powerful ways of talking about the intimacy of human mammals with other mammals that are resident in indigenous ways of knowing. And I think many people are willing to grant that without requiring an explanation of how a broadly animist metaphysics is going to mesh with a broadly materialist metaphysics. Does that make sense to you? Is that an adequate answer? It's yeah, right. What I mean, no, but do you have another?
No, I mean, it really is for me a question. My own inclination is to say that you need something more than matter. We could talk about what that is, but I think that it might well, in fact, be one of the most serious philosophical, theological, and scientific questions remaining to be answered. Whether we can sort of get to satisfying explanations of these sorts of phenomena without invoking anything other than
Yeah. So I would say, I think, thank you for the follow-up, because I think that what I mean to say is that my initial commitments are pragmatist. I'm interested in seeing what are the languages, the lexicons, the vocabularies that we use to talk about problems or disturbances or things that we feel that we need to talk about. And then we can begin to have second-order reflection on, well, what kind of metaphysical commitments would be required to, in the end, vindicate that we're both using the same kind of language or that we appreciate the same kind of language. And then, when it may not even be metaphysical, it might be just what commitments do we need, and do they have to get to metaphysical? I'm very suspicious of starting the other way, which is to say, let us work out a common metaphysical ground in order that we can then figure out how to talk together about these kinds of problems. So a strategy that I myself do not like very much in religion and environmental issues is to say, okay, we got to sort out that we all have this like a common story. One way that scientists and religionists are actively and productively cooperating is by trying to begin from the idea that there's a common creation story that we all share, a shared evolutionary epic, and that this epic can lead us to interpretive judgments about how we ought to live in the world. And I'm just not as comfortable proceeding in that direction.
Thank you all for coming. Please join us the west side of the room for some refreshments and more casual conversation. Thank you all for the great questions, and thank you again, Dr.